Hello, everybody. Very warm welcome to Art Week Tokyo online talk. The title of the talk is Art Education in Japan, Making Alternative Canon. My name is Yuko Shiomi from AIT Arts Initiative Tokyo. I manage this online talk series of Art Week Tokyo. The speaker for this talk is Andrew Maerkle and Roger McDonald. Andrew is a writer, editor, and translator based in Tokyo. Roger is a program director for AIT, based in Nagano. Okay, now I will hand over to Roger. Please enjoy the talk.
Hello, and welcome again to Art Week Tokyo online talk. And the title is Art Education in Japan, Making Alternative Canons. I'm here with Andrew. Hi, Andrew. And it's going to be a sort of back and forth between us talking about art and learning, art and education from a Japanese perspective. Perhaps we just begin with a very simple self-introductions, if possible. Do you want to go, Andrew?
Sure. Again, my name is Andrew Maerkle. I'm an art writer, editor, and translator based in Tokyo since 2008. And I also have a teaching practice, which I consider an important part of my overall critical project. I've taught a seminar with the Making Art Different program that is run by Arts Initiative Tokyo. And I now teach at Tokyo University of the Arts in the Global Art faculty.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And for myself, I was born and brought up in Tokyo, and I sort of returned to Japan in the late 90s. I'm a founding member of Arts Initiative Tokyo, a non-profit organization. We began MAD, which was an independent study program from 2000. So I've been the sort of director of that program for over 20 years now. I've taught at art universities, I've curated various exhibitions, and 10 years ago I moved out of Tokyo to live in Nagano Prefecture, where I am currently. So we both come from a fairly dense teaching, writing background, I think. So hopefully we can draw on both our perspectives and our experiences and cover what is probably fairly complex topic, but we'll try and make it as accessible as possible. And we're going to cover 4 or 5 fairly chunky topics, I think, hopefully. So perhaps just to get into this, the title includes the word canon, so making alternative canons. And maybe it's helpful just to begin by an overview of what a canon is in the art context. I mean, I think it's a fairly traditional classical art historical term, isn't it? I mean, I suppose one could talk about it as a kind of mainstream history, if there was one, that art perhaps has held for the last 100 years or so. Fairly Eurocentric, we could say. It has been fairly maybe patriarchal, male-based. And obviously for the last 20 or 30 years, this has been diversifying, expanding, breaking down in different ways. And living and working in Japan, as Andrew and I do, I think this is an issue which we're constantly having to grapple with, where we are situated, the history that we're embedded in, essentially, but also very much connected to a global situation. I feel that Japan certainly is very much part of a sort of globalized art community, certainly in terms of a market, in terms of exhibitions, probably from the 2000s in particular. I think it very much entered a sort of globalized art situation. But this is something me and Andrew often talk about, perhaps not so much in the realm of discourse, global art discourse. This is, I think, to do with many reasons. One important one being something which Andrew does professionally. Translation perhaps is a big issue. the speed or tempo of things being translated into Japanese and disseminated here in Japan amongst an art community, amongst an audience. So Andrew, if you want to add anything to just the initial observations about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember that art history for a long time has been structured as a genealogy or a lineage, and that, you know, the canon is sort of like the official lineage, as it were. So I think it's important to challenge that, you know, that conceptual structure. But also, you know, in Japan, a lot of people say, it's almost a cliche at this point, that there is no canon of Japanese modern and contemporary art, or there is no comprehensive history or historical lineage of Japanese modern and contemporary art. And so what we have is something more like a history of individual movements that spring up and then sort of decline and then are replaced with another movement that isn't quite connected. There's always a disconnect between one era and the next, or one movement and the next. There's a very strong atomization that we see in sort of Japanese art history, which you know, I think makes it difficult to establish a single overarching canon, and that is both a kind of a very generative situation, but also has a lot of challenges as well.
Yeah, exactly. I agree there, and I think today, particularly, Andrew's going to introduce a few books, publications, I think, which will kind of give a broad overview of these sort of different, almost sort of village-like art histories which have sprung, you know, since the post-war period. But perhaps you know, we can begin by actually zooming into Tokyo, where the Art Week is being held. And Tokyo, particularly in the post-war period, being actually a really fertile ground for alternative kinds of art education or art learning. I think this is something which we see in many metropolises around the world. But certainly in terms of avant-garde art post-war, Tokyo has a very kind of rich history of artists and scholars creating quite interesting alternatives to the major art universities, or sort of cram schools, if you like. And perhaps we could just begin by discussing some of this as a really interesting, I think, historical background to our discussion.
Yeah, and I think that plays into what you mentioned about sort of translation and sort of the back and forth between Japan and the US and Europe mainly, which is that, you know, I think institutions, both universities and museums, have sort of tended to establish one mode of modern art or contemporary art that they feel is sort of canonical, as it were. And then we see constantly people who are resisting that, those formations of institutional art, partly because, you know, it doesn't really work for them in terms of reflecting a Japanese lived reality, partly because they're also engaging in dialogue with developments in the US and Europe. And I think that's really driven a lot of these alternative education initiatives. And I was just recalling as I prepared for this talk that, you know, even in the pre-war period, there were initiatives such as the Shin Kenchiku Kougei Gakuin, the School of New Architecture and Design, which was established in 1932 by an architecture critic and writer, Kawakita Renshichiro, who was basically implementing ideas from the Bauhaus in Japan in an independent setting that that was sort of oppositional to what was being taught at the School of the Arts, I think is what it was called back then. The current at Tokyo University of the Arts. But yes, there's actually kind of an interesting lineage of these alternative art institutions throughout this sort of modern and contemporary period. But one in particular that I kind of wanted to ask you about, Roger, is called Bigakko, which was founded in 1969. And I think I always wonder to what extent it serves as a sort of model or precedent for what you're doing with MAD.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great point. Bigakko was founded in 1969 by Ishii Kyoji, and it's still going on. I've actually taught there for a semester. Artists, thinkers, in its heyday in the 60s, it very much came out of, just to give a historical context, the student protests, trade unions protests from the late 60s. It was very much a kind of child of that, I think, countercultural movement, you can say. It's very much takes a kind of counter stance to official art training in Japan, which has tended to, is still, I think, in many ways based on a very classical European academic model to gain entrance into art universities in Japan. I think many places still require students to complete various life drawing tests, plaster model drawing tests to gain entrance. So it's very skill based, it's very academic, and not so discourse based, one could say. And Bigakko very much took a much more sort of DIY approach, I think, to this. It's in central Tokyo. It's very much in the metropolis. And from the 60s, they invited avant-garde artists, dancers, thinkers as teachers, as professors in. And I think in its heyday, they had principally two really interesting kind of approaches to teaching. One is tewaza in Japanese, which literally means sort of hand skill. So basically making things or actually sort of praxis, I suppose you can say. And the other, I think, being a sort of very close student-teacher relationship. So it's very much based on small seminars in which there would be maybe 10 to 15 students attached to a teacher, and they would develop a very sort of close learning kind of relationship. And, through the 60s and early 70s, many seminal teachers, poets, filmmakers, there were seminars on, surrealism, certainly on art movements happening abroad, anarchist poetry, for instance, Indian symbolism, so things coming from very much an Asian perspective. Hijikata Tatsumi, the famous Buto dancer, for instance, was doing a class on Nikutairon, body theory. But perhaps, if I could introduce one seminar, which certainly has influenced my teaching in some ways, was by the avant-garde sort of proto-conceptual Japanese artist Yutaka Matsuzawa, who taught at Bigakko in the early 70s. And he led a really interesting course. I'll just share my screen here. So he led a quite an interesting pioneering type of course at Bigakko. In Japanese, the name of his title was Saishu Bijitsu Shiko Kobo, which I suppose translated is something like the final art thinking. It's very much based on Matsuzawa's practice as an artist. He has a very sort of pioneering and interesting theory about the end of civilization or humanity. He thought that humanity would go extinct by 2220, basically because of overpopulation, ecological pollution, destruction, a material civilization running amok. So for him, most of his work is very much based around these ideas of an ending, of something sort of the final art. And this particular course that he ran at Bigakko, for a few years, this is the Japanese flyer which he made for it. And in the English side, I've put 1 to 27, which is in the flyer. He's building a course based around these particular key words. So, you know, if we look through the list, there are things like post-minimalism, psychology, anarchism, very much ideas which were in the air at the time, coming from the East Coast, West Coast of the States, from Europe, utopian thinking, also Pan-Asian kinds of thinking, mandalic sort of ideas, emptiness and nothingness, esoteric Buddhism. Matsuzawa was very much interested in esoteric Buddhism as opposed to Zen Buddhism, which is kind of very interesting, I think. Also things like science fiction, and the actual course was based mainly around discussions and workshops rather than making objects. And they would include interesting things like spirit photography experiments, simple sort of meditation type experiments. And it was, you know, even from today's perspective, I think a fairly innovative course, curriculum for students to be involved in, and really sort of bringing in non-art, I suppose you can say, aspects very much into the art learning environment, to think about the world as it was and where it might be going. Very much a kind of almost like a futurology kind of lab, I suppose you can say. So this is, you know, something which certainly has impacted my own sort of teaching in many ways, I think. Its scope, its kind of visionary sort of sense, very holistic, I suppose you can say. So I think this is one interesting historical example that perhaps I'd like to just share briefly.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to maybe mention that a lot of these alternative art organizations, Bigakko, the MAD program run by AIT, there's also Bizemi in Yokohama, is another important alternative art organization that was active at the same time as Bigakko. All of these are more or less open to anybody. They're not exactly selecting people based on the criteria of having a portfolio of artwork or kind of specialist knowledge. Yeah,
that's really true. So it's basically open to just working people. It could be students, of course, who've dropped out of art universities. And I think that's a really interesting ground from which, you know, we can think about this as well. More recently, maybe, you know, there are interesting kind of things happening now as well, since the 2000s, since 2010s. Pa Plume is one we can maybe just mention in passing. It's founded by some young artists who are kind of trying to bypass this quite academic, almost arcane system of juken benkyo. And to gain entry into art university, you have to go through these various sort of prep schools, I guess, or, you know, cram schools. So they're like, you know, we're not really interested in that, so we're just going to start our own little kind of studio school. So I think they're still going there.
They were founded by the artist Yoichi Umetsu in 2014.
Right, yeah.
I know they're still active. I think what's really interesting is that he's also specifically turned it into a platform for marginal artists, things that would be basically considered outsider art.
Right, yeah.
People who he meets online are kind of, or who follow him online will then come from places like Tottori or, you know, other parts, far outside of Tokyo area. They'll come to, they'll move to I think he's in Sagamihara, actually. He's in a town in between Yokohama and Tokyo, but they'll move there and join his class.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. But the other important thing is, I think, Park Bloom's essential critique of the university entrance exam system within the art education system is, in fact, also a sort of critique of the broader education system in Japan, because not just art, but pretty much all the disciplines require this very intensive cram school preparation, and people take standardized tests that are then basically deciding their futures. So I think it's really, you know, that's probably, I mean, that's certainly a motivating factor for the Park Bloom project, but I think it's also a subtext for all of the alternative art education examples.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Maybe just to add to this section, I mean, we've both taught at art universities as well now, and I don't know if you found this, but I've certainly, you know, back in the early 2000s when I started teaching at art universities, one thing that really struck me was a kind of very limited teaching available of just basic sort of art history 101 for the fine art practice people, and even for, you know, people interested in arts management or curating. And it was almost like, you know, in first years, I think they were obliged to do half a year of like basic art history, and that was dependent totally on just the teacher teaching it. So if they were like a Spanish Renaissance specialist, they might just get lectures on Goya or something. So and I've always felt that has prevented a kind of common basic language to which you know, artists could begin to develop a discourse about art, what's happening outside of Japan, what's happening in Japan, you know, how to, the vocabulary to even talk about a painting or sculpture. And I mean, it's changing, I think, gradually, but still I feel, I mean, just compared to what I know in the UK, for instance, where art history is a kind of first year must, it's a compulsory sort of thing, which forms a grounding. And then from the second year, you can just sort of deconstruct it as much as you want, but at least it forms a kind of shared common language to gain entry to. And, you know, I often link this to maybe a kind of hesitancy or a kind of fear almost of history, maybe you can say, in Japanese culture, certainly post-Meiji Revolution, 1870s. This is something which the sociologist Miyadai Shinji, who I read a lot, he kind of talks about a deep kind of amnesia in Japan post-Meiji. There's a real kind of more interest in, rather than sort of a deep, thoughtful, continuing historical perspective. It's more about just sort of things, almost like a omatsuri, like festivals happening, and then they sort of disappear, and another festival will happen and disappear. It's a bit similar to what you were saying, actually, about the canon in Japan itself is composed of these sort of movements which come and go without maybe a kind of deeper analysis which stretches across time. I mean, it's a bit of an abstract thing I'm saying here, but that's something certainly I felt teaching at university.
Yeah. And obviously the amnesia has something to do with the legacy of the Japanese Empire as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But, you know, the artist Kenjiro Okazaki, who also directed an alternative education program called Yotsuya Art Studium from, I think, 2004 to 2014. He's very interested in education in Japan, and I was reading an interview of his recently where he also, you know, made this point that you need a shared history, you need a shared problematic. Specifically in the education field, you need a shared problematic between the teachers and the students in order to create a critical discourse. In order to create critical thinking, you have to have some kind of common ground that also has a continuity to it as well. And that's something that I think he was trying to do with the Art Studium curriculum. He, for example, I think there were three pillars of Art Studium, which was, one was like, creative workshops. The other was technical training. And then the third was theoretical or historical grounding. And that seems very basic, or almost, why wouldn't you start with those three pillars? But it's something that actually does get kind of lost in the shuffle in a lot of institutional educational settings.
Absolutely. Maybe that's a good base to go into your little section about bibliographies, maybe, and books. Do you want to just introduce that, perhaps?
Yeah, I prepared some slides to share with everybody, so I'll share screen now. Yeah, so I think, there are a number of books there. I mean, there are many great books on Japanese art history, both kind of from a broader viewpoint and looking at specific movements or fields of practice. But I just wanted to put forth a few books today that would sort of present a kind of layered overview of specifically, I guess, post-war Japanese art history. But I've chosen books that are essentially available in both English and Japanese, because we have both English and Japanese viewers joining us for this talk. And the first one, I think the starting point, if you're new to Japanese modern and contemporary art, or if you have been following it, but you haven't really had a strong historical grounding in it, Japanese art after 1945, Scream Against the Sky, is the place to start. This is the classic textbook of modern and contemporary Japanese art, charting a chronological development of oppositional art movements in post-war Japan. And it's a catalog for an exhibition curated by Alexandra Monroe in 1994 at the Yokohama Museum of Art. It then traveled to the Guggenheim Museum Soho in New York in 94-95, and then the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. But the catalog, the English catalog at least, features texts by Monroe, John Clark, Arata Isazaki, Barbara London. It has a compendium of translations of important critical writings by Rei Kotomi. So it combines serious academic research with a kind of exhibition-making ethos. And it was particularly strong on Gutai, Neo-Dada, Fluxus, and Monoha. And so it kind of established sort of the main points that people keep returning to when they talk about Japanese post-war art. Although, of course, there's been a lot of additional research and modification of the narrative since then. The next book, I'm jumping now to The Age of Micropop, the New Generation of Japanese Artists, which is a catalog for an exhibition that the critic Midori Matsui organized for Art Tower Mito in 2007. And this is a compact exhibition of 15 essentially young artists who emerged after the collapse of the bubble economy in the early 1990s. So the collapse of the bubble was a watershed generational moment in Japan, or watershed generational divide in Japan. And it still exerts a profound influence on Japanese culture and society today. So this exhibition is kind of summing up or assessing Japanese contemporary art production since the collapse of the bubble. And Matsui is inspired by Deleuze and Guattari's concept of minor literature. She argues that essentially Japanese artists have been marginalized in mass society, mass media society, mass entertainment society, mass production society. And so they're finding ways to resist that marginalization through intimate practices rather than sort of large-scale practices. And so I think this is one of the most cogent overviews of recent Japanese contemporary art, despite its compactness. And just to add, Micropop is part of a cohort of important exhibitions on Japanese contemporary art since the 1990s. These include Noi Sawaragi's Ground Zero Japan, which was also held at Art Tower Mito in 1999. And Takashi Murakami's Superflat series of exhibitions, which essentially were held between 2000 and 2005. But what distinguishes Micropop from those other two examples is that it was repackaged as a traveling exhibition sponsored by the Japan Foundation. The title is Winter Garden, The Exploration of the Micropop Imagination in Contemporary Japanese Art. And it toured across more than 20 countries across 6 continents from 2009 to 2019. So, this exhibition or this thesis has quietly been shaping the global image of Japanese contemporary art for the past decade. Moving on, I think one critique we could make of Matsui, Sawaragi, and Murakami, and to a lesser extent, Alexandra Monroe's academic approach, is that they are all in some way seeking to identify a uniquely Japanese tradition of contemporary art or modern and contemporary art, but that in itself may be a misapprehension of the nature of modern and contemporary art, which is always already sort of international and dispersed. And so Kenjiro Okazaki's exhibition, How Abstract Arts Can Become Concrete Tools, Abstract Art as Impact, which was organized for the Toyota Municipal Museum of Art in 2017, is a kind of rejoinder to that approach. And he's basically attempting a decentered and critical reading of the development of abstract art across both Japanese and international contexts. And he's creating these interesting pairings like the Japanese artist Onchi Koshiro and Hilma af Klimt, who are both working on the margins of modern art and avant-garde art at the start of the 20th century. And they both independently arrived at their own abstract visual languages, more or less in advance of Kandinsky. And so, one point that Okazaki makes is that, the introduction of progressive education to Japan at the end of the 19th century, when the ideas of educators like Frederick Froebel, Maria Montessori, and Rudolf Steiner were being brought to Japan and integrated into the primary school education, had already basically created the groundwork for Japanese artists from the 20th century onwards to develop their own abstract languages. So I think that's a really interesting argument of how, contemporary art or modern and contemporary art is not necessarily fixed to a specific place or culture. Another very important book is Anarchy of the Body, Undercurrents of Performance Art in 1960s Japan. This book is undergoing translation. It's being translated by the Bunkacho's Art Platform Japan initiative. I am actually one of the translators working on the project along with several others. We've divided the book up into sections because it's, I think, 700 pages or or so. It's a massive volume to deal with. But this is a really groundbreaking study of alternative art practices, or what the author Kuroda Daiji, who is a curator and researcher based in Fukuoka, calls anti-art performance. And so he's looking at practices in the 1960s that were doubly or triply marginalized because they did not conform to established genres of art or theater or dance. B, they were emerging from outside of the metropolitan centers. A lot of the artists who were practicing anti-art performance were either based in or made projects in regional centers, or even, I think Matsuzawa Yutaka is a good example, someone who wasn't even in a city. He's out in the countryside. And then C, they also use the body in ways that are kind of disturbing for the sort of disciplined, modern, productive society. So they're touching on sort of socio-political issues that are maybe being repressed in the mainstream narrative. And so this book, it introduces important artists and groups like Zero Jigen, who are kind of doing weird ritualistic actions in urban space. They would march naked through the streets while wearing gas masks. It also is a critique of the writing or the narratives of mainstream art history, and specifically the focus in art history on artworks that exist as objects. So the art that Kuroda is looking at is, it doesn't exist as an artwork necessarily. There's documentation sometimes through photographs and occasionally film or video, but there's not anything that you could really say is a work as such. And then finally, I think, we talked about the inherent patriarchy or patriarchalism of art history. So it's important to introduce the work of the curator Reiko Kokatsu, who was organizing a series of exhibitions on women artists for the Tochigi Prefectural Museum of Arts from the 1990s to quite recently. But two of those exhibitions in particular, Japanese women artists before and after World War II, 1930s to 1950s, and Japanese women artists in avant-garde movements, 1950 to 1975, are very important for the practices of Japanese women artists who are working on heavily patriarchal conditions in the pre-war and immediate post-war periods. And in her catalog essays, Kokatsu digs into the social conditions that were shaping women's art practices in Japan. But, for example, she introduces someone like Yuki Katsura, who have kind of developed their own practices, both within and without the male-dominated art establishment in Japan.
Great, that's really useful, Andrew. Thank you. I think just looking at it, it reminded me how, in a sense, dominant a kind of we can call a kind of very metropolitan Tokyo-based, it's almost called neo-pop, isn't it? That kind of history, very narrow history, you've really sort of opened it up, I think, and offered different kind of readings, different histories there. Okazaki, Kuroda, Kokatsu's exhibitions, I think they're just three very good examples of how much richer much more complex histories are in Japan, and they certainly will inform sort of curriculum building, I think, for future art learning from Japan, I think. So it's very, very useful. Thank you.
Yeah, can I just add one thing, though?
Yeah.
It is really important for Japanese art educators today to take a kind of feminist stance in presenting art history, because one of the problems with having a patriarchal society is that the sort of patriarchy, that sort of marginalization of women's practices that occurred in the 1930s or that occurred in the 1950s is then replicated in the historical narrative, because you say, well, there weren't really any women artists practicing then, or there were women artists, but they weren't really doing anything important then. And so I think you really need to take a kind of element of critical feminism with you into looking at the history, and that is precisely what we're talking about when we talk about making alternative canons, I think.
Yeah, I think this is a great point. We could probably come back to things which will touch on this towards the end. But maybe at this point, I'd like to introduce another kind of big historical event, I suppose we can say, which happened in Japan and which has informed, I think, art and art thinking here quite substantially. And that was the great earthquakes and nuclear disasters of so-called 3.11, 3-11, 2011 March disasters. And in many ways, this series of catastrophes sort of spurred artists and thinkers and the art scene in Japan to really sort of question the sort of social meanings that art has in a society, what it can do in response to such kind of tragedy. And at the same time, I think it kind of created sort of blind spots in many ways, because it was such a sort of massive, overwhelming event. People really focus in on it as a sort of turning point, a flexion point. Whereas, as both of us, we lived through the early 2000s in Japan. It's not as if Japanese artists suddenly sort of found a social engagement from, the day after the earthquakes and the disasters. I think this has been a constant, and I think Bigakko is a very good example of that. But also pre-311, through the early 2000s, thinking about Tokyo, I think there's a real interest in, for instance, a rethinking of public spaces. There are a number of really interesting initiatives by artist collectives, by video collectives. In Shibuya, for instance, one of the major commercial centers of Tokyo, there used to be a great park called Miyashita Park, which used to be a real gathering hub for protests and demonstrations, would launch from this park. And that was taken over by the city. It was kind of issues of privatization were happening, and artists stood up to that. And this was all happening in the early 2000s. There are interesting kind of exhibitions, I think, happening through the early 2000s, looking at issues of public space. Video collectives, in particular, I think, had a very strong kind of role to play in this in Japan. Remo is one that just comes to mind, I think, which were making really interesting work. 2008, you remember this, Antonio Negri, the philosopher, was due to come to Tokyo to give lectures, and his visa was denied for some strange reason. I remember going to the press conference at the International House about this, and this caused kind of quite a lot of interest amongst the art community as well, I think. And so there have been these really interesting kind of developments in terms of social art, I suppose we can call it, which perhaps were kind of catalyzed by what happened on 3/11. and since. So I don't know if you want to add something to that, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, one reason I think Aichi's book is really important is because it's looking at practices that were going into public space, you know, at a time when public space was still heavily contested, you know, with the student movement and large-scale protests. But you know, being the most obvious instance of that, but you know, having artists parade naked through a shopping arcade in Shinjuku is another way of kind of contesting public space that I think has, you know, really it's become a lot more difficult to do that now, and I would say maybe it's even been co-opted in sort of this regional art festival phenomenon where you have people going into disused schools, disused homes, disused infrastructure, and presenting art there, which is sometimes quite socially engaged and critical, but it sort of neutralizes that element of public space because everyone knows, like, hey, this is a disused school, you know, it's not an actual school. And so, yeah, I think maybe it, you know, there has been a kind of strange confluence where critical practices have been sort of swept into a safe space, you know, you know, rather than actually being put in position to.
Yeah. No, I think this is a really good point. And I mean, perhaps one moment where that kind of reared its head very much into a public moment was the Aichi Triennale in Nagoya, where there was this very visible contestation of an art exhibition through direct censorship from local government and the governor. I know you were involved in a lot of the debate around that, Andrew, and I think the whole Aichi censorship debate can be seen, you know, as a very informal artist, activist-led kind of learning space, out of which flourished actually a kind of protocol for freedom of expression in Japan. And you were involved in translating this, so perhaps you can just briefly mention this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic, and actually, when you introduce this section by saying that I want to talk about a major event that has defined Aichi, but you know, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but of course, the thing with Aichi, it happened in I think it started in July 2019, and the controversy played out during the entire run of the exhibition.
So perhaps you can just say a very quick sentence about what this is for people who don't know what it was.
Yeah. So what happened was the Aichi Triennale organized, as part of the exhibition, a presentation on kind of increasing restrictions on freedom of speech in Japanese art spaces. And this presentation included works dealing with the image of the emperor and dealing with the comfort woman issue of sexual slavery and exploitation perpetrated by the Japanese military during the imperial period, not just during World War II. It actually goes back further than that. And so these works were then targeted by right-wing nationalists who felt that they were anti-Japanese and wanted to remove them from the exhibition. Ultimately, there were terroristic threats, there were death threats, you know, sort of very harassing phone calls that promised to attack not just the exhibition space, but schools and kindergartens came under threat as well. And, you know, it was not censorship from the government as such. It was actually the Triennale organizers who made the decision to withdraw the works by shutting down that display area. And so, yeah, there was a lot of, there were immediately, this happened within 3 days of the exhibition opening, I should add. So there were immediately responses from critical organizations, and the participating artists also quickly organized to push back against the closure of the After Freedom of Expression display. And one group in particular that emerged out of that was called Refreedom Aichi. And I was involved with that group. And so they pressured the exhibition organizers through sort of hataraki kake. What is that word in English?
Kind of lobbying, or
kind of a lobbying thing. But also they ended up getting permission to introduce a sort of a wall of post-it notes where people could write about their experiences of repression and post it onto the wall that was blocking off the withdrawn display. And they also organized talk events in Nagoya and elsewhere to discuss the problem. At one of the talk events that I attended, ultranationalist activists actually showed up, and there was a kind of interesting back and forth between the two crowds. And they also organized, Refreedom Aichi also organized a series of workshops to produce a document called the Aichi Declaration / Protocol, which proposes a new protocol for dealing with artists and artworks in exhibition spaces in Japan, obviously centered around the issue of freedom of speech and the rights of the artist to express themselves.
So that was a really kind of concrete document that emerged out of this situation. It's available in English, I think, online if you search for it. So I mean, I think that was a kind of a really seminal kind of text, I think, which has emerged really in the last 3 or 4 years now. So
I would just add, though, that what happened then is basically the controversy continued all the way to the end of 2019, and then we entered 2020, and in March 2020 everybody gets locked down. In Japan it was a soft lockdown, but for the coronavirus pandemic. And so this is a huge historical event that took place, but because of the coronavirus, it hasn't quite played out in the way that we would have expected it, or we haven't been able to see the full ramifications of it yet.
Yeah, no, I think this is really true. I know that we're on a time constraint too, and I wanted to just move into our final area, which we've kind of touched on, which you mentioned briefly, the rural art festivals, in Japanese geijutsusai, which have been a feature of the contemporary art scene here for 20 years, since the very first Echigo Tsumari art triennale happened in 99, 2000, I think. This is a movement which I wouldn't say it's specific to Japan, but I think in its form that it's taken in Japan, it's become fairly specific to Japan, even though it cites Münster Sculpture Festival and other international festivals as precedents. It's become a very strange blend of local politics, of revitalization of local economies with art and volunteering. It's a real blend, and some more successful than others, clearly. The legacies of these sort of rural art festivals, I think, as perhaps another very unique ground out of which a kind of art learning, or a different kind of art curriculum maybe can emerge. And I think as someone who lives rurally for the last 10 years, I sort of, very much feel that this has a kind of very specific historical lineage in Japan and potentials, I think, going forward post whatever COVID or however the art world is going to unravel itself going forward. But here, perhaps I'd just like to introduce a book which I've found very useful in this, and which only came out last year, 2020. It's by Tessa Morris Suzuki. She's not an art historian or an art scholar. She's a sociologist, a critical theorist, but this is a really, really interesting book, not available in Japanese, I think. It's called Japan's Living Politics, Grassroots Action and the Crises of Democracy. And Suzuki, in this book, it makes a very, very interesting case, actually very similar to Kuroda Raiji in Anarchism of the Body in many ways, but coming from a more sociological, historical perspective. And she just happens to use as a case study the area which I live in, which is central Nagano. And she makes a really, really compelling historical case that in Japan there have been, for the last 120 years at least, very, very strong grassroots, bottom-up citizens activism, citizens autonomy movements for greater democracy at a local level. And a great important part of this was what is called lifelong learning. And she looks at, for instance, sort of very famous literary groups like the Shirakaba, the White Birch group, which was very active in the 1910s, 1920s, artists associated with this, people like Mushano Koji Saneatsu, who was a sort of activist, a writer in the Taisho, early Showa period. Who were very, very influenced by the Russian commune movements, what was happening in anarchist thinking in Europe, and transposing this into a Japanese context and actually creating village commune movements in Japan, Noson Undo, sort of farming collectives in Japan. And in amongst all this, certain artists are also involved. Yamamoto Kanai, perhaps, is the most famous. He's said to be the founder of experimental printmaking in Japan. And he also, in the 1920s, 30s, he lives not so far from where I live, in a place called Ueda in Nagano. And he returns from studies in Paris, probably full of alternative avant-garde ideas about art learning, art teaching. And he takes over teaching at a primary school. He initiates all sorts of very, very innovative kinds of teaching methods. He opens schools up until sort of, late at night, for instance, so that students and teachers can just kind of come and go from a school as if it were a community center. Unheard of at the time in Japan. So this is sort of going back to our earlier conversations about the sort of strictures of Japanese formal education. And these have been challenged, I think, quite consistently from, early century by artists, by civic activists. And kind of very interesting histories, which I think continue in various ways, partly through these rural art exhibitions, and their experiments with volunteering, for instance, living in local communities. Some have been very successful, I think, in that. And I think there are models, I think, within this of, perhaps different kinds of art learning, which we can really sort of explore into the future. For instance, in Japan, there is a kind of informal learning space traditionally called the terakoya, which usually was allied or paired with a Buddhist temple traditionally. And it would be just a little village or community space where kids would come to learn writing and reading. And that as a very informal kind of model of local learning. There's another very interesting architectural type learning space called a kominkan. I suppose in English would be a sort of like a community space or a civic space. And the kominkan also provides a very interesting kind of alternative model to formal art learning, art universities, I think. This is also open to non-students, open to elderly people, young people, kids, and certainly in the countryside, more than I think the big metropolises, these sort of kominkan, terakoya kind of movements have been actually quite deeply embedded. And from my perspective, I think they do provide a very interesting kind of potential for, you know, how art learning can move forward post-COVID, for instance, when travel has certainly kind of become much more localized, and perhaps the art world itself has become much more sort of digitalized, and, you know, we can't sort of see each other in person. So these are things which I'm thinking about certainly now as possibilities for where and how art learning can develop.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, you know, the issue of the regional art festivals is very complex, you know, because it is sort of, it's alternative and it's regional, but it's also, you know, tied up in state agendas as well. And I know the artist Kawamata Tadashi Kawamata actually was writing about this in 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004. So there's an essay that is on the Art Platform Japan website, where he already identified some of the problematics of using art as an instrument for revitalization. So this was a pattern that had already emerged by the start of the 2000s and has only gained steam since then. But yeah, I think another model for lifelong learning outside of beyond the terakoya, which is kind of a pre-modern model, is the benkyokai.
So, yeah.
Study group.
Like study groups, yeah.
Yeah, you know, so there's like in the immediate post-war period, there's the avant-garde Geijutsu Kenkyukai, the avant-garde art study group, which is sort of kind of like a benkyokai model and an incubator for a lot of the artists who went on to form Jiken Kobo, experimental workshop, as well as, I think, you know, the reportage painting movement as well too. So you know, I think there are all these examples of where Japanese society or people in Japan have come up with different ways of circumventing this sort of very top-down, state-mandated education system.
Yeah.
Oh, and sorry, just to, you know, for English viewers, Tessamore Suzuki is a really, you know, great academic and researcher. And she has a book called Reinventing Japan, Time, Space, Nation, which is a great, I like to recommend it to a lot of people whenever I can, as a sort of an introduction to some of this sort of issues regarding nationalism and ideology.
Yeah, she's also has great research on the Ainu in Hokkaido, so she's looking into indigenous rights as well. So a very good Japanese scholar, I think, all around there.
Maybe that, you know, mentioning the Ainu, it's important to know that she's from Australia. So that sort of informs her practice as well.
Absolutely. No, it's fantastic. So, I mean, I think we probably have to start wrapping up. Unfortunately, we could probably go on for a few more hours, but things being what they are, hopefully, so we've tried to offer various sort of historical, social, cultural frameworks from Japan, where we are both based, to hopefully rethink what art learning, art education could be like, different kinds of canons, the challenges involved in that, clearly, the many blind spots that happen, the less visible alternatives, I think, which are clearly there. perhaps amongst all of this, there's still this big question of, we started the discussion with the lack of a kind of shared critical discourse, a shared critical history, perhaps amongst artists, amongst sort of art people in Japan. And maybe this continues to be something which is quite a challenge, I think. Maybe it's all right. Maybe we don't need a big sort of shared canon. This is something me and Andrew have talked about for years, I think. And maybe in Japan there is a very just a different historical kind of narratives, which is very plural, which is kind of full of minor kind of histories.
I think it's and then it's a question of how can you harness that, or how can you manage it in some way on an individual level as well as on a broader social level. But there's even, I think it's kind of like the Sisyphean engine, perpetual movement engine, where it just keeps pushing people to produce more and more innovative readings of history. There are so many that we couldn't include today, but somewhat recently there was also another big book called 美術の日本近現代史制度言説造形 Histories of Modern and Contemporary Japan through Art, Institutions, Discourse, Practice. This is not available in English, but it's basically an encyclopedia of Japanese art from the Meiji period onward. And it also touches upon, for example, Japanese art practices in the colonies, and that kind of exchange between Japan and Korea, Japan and Taiwan. So, I think there's a lot of great research and analysis being published both in Japanese and other languages, and then the problem is also finding time and energy and financing to translate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the perpetual question of amnesia, I suppose, of not forgetting, which comes with this territory, I suppose. So hopefully we've managed to provide some sort of structure, some historical overview today. Clearly, as Andrew says, it's not going to be a comprehensive at all, but perhaps it's a starter for people to start their own researches, their own thinking. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening. Thanks, Andrew. It was really nice.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye.